Simony was a sin. It was the act of buying or selling spiritual things. The name comes from a story in the Bible. In the Acts of the Apostles, a man named Simon Magus sees the apostles Peter and John performing miracles. He sees them lay hands on people, and those people receive the Holy Spirit. Simon, who was a sorcerer himself, was impressed. He saw this not as a divine gift, but as a powerful trick, a form of superior magic he could add to his own collection. So he offered the apostles money. He said, "Give me this power also, so that anyone on whom I lay my hands may receive the Holy Spirit." He wanted to buy God's grace. He treated the power of the Holy Spirit like a product on a shelf. And Peter's reaction was not subtle. He was horrified. He told Simon, "May your silver perish with you, because you thought you could obtain the gift of God with money." Peter saw Simon's offer as a deep corruption, a complete misunderstanding of what faith was. You could not buy salvation. You could not purchase a place in the divine order. The things of God were not for sale at any price. This was the core belief. From this story, the church created the concept of simony. It became the official term for trying to purchase the sacred. In the medieval world, this idea expanded far beyond just buying the power to perform miracles. It came to cover a wide range of actions that mixed money with faith. The most common form of simony was the buying and selling of church offices. An office, like a bishop or an abbot, was not just a job. It was a sacred trust, a spiritual responsibility. A bishop was a successor to the apostles. An abbot was the spiritual father of his monastery. These roles were supposed to be given to the most holy, the most worthy, the most capable men. They were to be chosen through prayer and spiritual discernment, but that is not what happened. Instead, these offices were often sold to the highest bidder. A rich nobleman might want his second son, who was not a particularly good soldier, to become a bishop. It was a respectable and powerful position, so the family would pay the king, or another powerful bishop, a large sum of money. In return, their son would be appointed. It did not matter if he was pious. It did not matter if he could even read the Latin of the Mass. What mattered was the payment. This was a direct violation of the principle set down by Peter. It was treating a sacred office, a spiritual calling, as a piece of property. The man who bought his office was called a simoniac. He was seen as fundamentally illegitimate, a wolf in shepherd's clothing. His authority was tainted from the start. How could a man who bought his way into the church possibly lead his flock to salvation? His own soul was already in peril. Simony also extended to the sacraments themselves. The sacraments were the physical rituals that the church taught were essential for a Christian life and for salvation. Baptism, confession, communion, marriage, and last rites were seen as channels of God's grace. They were supposed to be given freely to all believers, but in many places, a corrupt priest would demand a fee. A peasant might have to pay to have his child baptized. A dying man's family might be forced to pay for him to receive his final communion and last rites. This was perhaps the most cruel form of simony. It preyed on the deepest fears and hopes of ordinary people. It put a price tag on peace with God. It made salvation seem like something only the wealthy could afford. Even holy objects were part of this corrupt market. These were called relics. A relic could be the bone of a saint, a piece of wood from the true cross, or a scrap of cloth from the Virgin Mary's veil. These objects were believed to have spiritual power. Praying before them could bring healing or forgiveness. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to be near them. Naturally, they became incredibly valuable. And so they were bought, sold, and stolen. Churches and monasteries competed to have the best relics. An entire industry of forgeries emerged. A traveling merchant might sell a dozen different skulls of John the Baptist to unsuspecting villages. This trade in relics was another form of simony because it involved assigning a monetary value to a sacred object. It turned faith into a collection. To the reformers within the medieval church, simony was not just a minor problem. It was a cancer, it was a heresy that poisoned everything it touched. It demonstrated a complete lack of faith. A man who bought an office or sold a sacrament clearly did not believe in the spiritual reality of what he was doing. He saw the church as a business, a way to gain wealth and power. Simony replaced piety with ambition and faith with greed. It undermined the entire moral authority of the church. If a bishop bought his position, why should anyone listen to his sermons about the evils of greed? If a priest charged for confession, why should anyone believe he was a true agent of God's forgiveness? The entire structure was built on a foundation of spiritual truth. Simony rotted that foundation from within, leaving a hollow and corrupt shell. The fight against the sin would become one of the most important struggles of the entire Middle Ages. It was a battle for the very soul of the church. The problem of simony did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of the very soil of the early medieval world. It was a natural consequence of the political and social system that emerged after the collapse of the Roman Empire. That system is now called feudalism. Feudalism was a world built on land, loyalty, and warfare. Power was not abstract. It was tied directly to the control of territory. A king was powerful because he controlled a kingdom. A duke was powerful because he controlled a duchy, and a bishop was powerful because he controlled a diocese. This last part is the key. A medieval bishop was not just a spiritual leader, he was a major feudal lord. The church had accumulated vast amounts of land over centuries, donations from pious nobles, gifts from kings, and the careful management of its own property had made the church the largest landowner in Europe. A bishopric or a major abbey was not just a church building and a title. It was an enormous estate, complete with forests, farms, villages, and serfs. It generated huge revenues from rents and taxes. The man who controlled this land, the bishop or the abbot, was a major political player. He was expected to provide the king with knights for his army. He sat on the king's council and advised him on matters of state. He administered justice in his own courts. In many ways, his duties were indistinguishable from those of a secular duke or count. Because bishops and abbots held so much land and power, secular rulers felt they had a right to choose them. A king could not afford to have a powerful bishop in a strategic region who was his enemy. He needed loyal men in those positions. He needed men who would support him in wars, pay their taxes, and follow his political lead. The spiritual qualifications of the candidate were often a secondary concern. The primary concern was loyalty and political usefulness. The king saw the lands of a bishopric as part of his kingdom, and he believed it was his right to grant that land and the office that went with it to whomever he chose. This practice was called lay investiture. When a bishop died, the king or emperor would select his replacement. He would then invest the new bishop with the symbols of his office. He would present the bishop with a ring and a crozier, a staff shaped like a shepherd's crook. These were spiritual symbols. The ring signified the bishop's marriage to the church, and the crozier symbolized his duty to care for his flock. For a layman, a king, to bestow these sacred symbols was, in the eyes of church reformers, a terrible offense. It suggested that the bishop's authority came from the king, not from God. It made the church seem like just another department of the state. From lay investiture, it was a very short step to outright simony. If a king could choose the bishop, why not make a profit from it? Kings always needed money. Wars were expensive, and the administrative machinery of a kingdom ran on cash. Selling a vacant bishopric was an easy and effective way to fill the royal treasury. So, when a see became available, it was often put up for auction. Different candidates would make their bids. The one who offered the most money, or the most political favors, would get the job. The king got his money and a loyal subject. The new bishop got a powerful and lucrative position. The only thing lost in the transaction was the spiritual integrity of the church. This problem existed at every level of society. It was not just kings and emperors selling bishoprics. A local lord might have built a church on his own land for the use of his villagers. This was called a proprietary church. He felt that since he had paid for the building and endowed it with land, he owned it. He therefore claimed the right to appoint the priest. And, just like the king, he would often sell the position to a man who was willing to pay. This priest would then have to make his investment back by charging fees for services and keeping the tithes that were supposed to support the church and the poor. The men who bought these offices were often completely unsuited for them. They were not chosen for their piety, their learning, or their pastoral skills. They were chosen for their wealth or their connections. A bishop might be a career soldier who had never opened a Bible. A priest might be the illiterate son of a local merchant. This had a devastating effect on the spiritual life of ordinary people. The clergy was supposed to be the moral and spiritual guide for society, but when the clergy itself was seen as corrupt, cynical, and greedy, it eroded faith in the entire institution. People began to question whether the sacraments administered by a Simoniac priest were even valid. If the man himself was in a state of mortal sin, how could he possibly bring God's grace to others? Simony created a deep spiritual crisis. It was a systemic problem woven into the very fabric of the feudal world. To solve it would require more than just condemning a few bad apples. It would require a revolution in the relationship between the church and the state. By the middle of the 11th century, many people within the church realized that simony and lay investiture were destroying it from the inside. A powerful reform movement began to grow. Its goal was simple and radical: to free the church from the control of secular lords and to purify it of its worldly corruption. The center of this movement was, at first in the monasteries, particularly the great Abbey of Cluny in France. The Cluniac monks followed a strict version of the Benedictine rule and emphasized prayer, piety, and independence from local political control. They created a network of daughter houses that were loyal only to their abbot, and through him to the Pope in Rome. They created a vision of a church that was organized, centralized, and most importantly, spiritually pure. This reforming spirit eventually reached Rome itself. A series of popes, influenced by these ideas, began to issue decrees against simony and the marriage of priests, which was another common practice seen as a source of corruption. But the movement's most powerful and uncompromising champion was a man named Hildebrand. He was not a nobleman, but a man of humble origins who rose through the ranks of the church in Rome through sheer force of will and intellect. For decades, he was the power behind the papal throne, advising popes and driving the reform agenda forward. In 1073, he was elected pope himself, taking the name Gregory VII. Gregory VII was not a man of compromise. He had a clear and dramatic vision for the world. He believed that the church was founded by God, and that the pope, as the successor of St. Peter, was God's supreme representative on earth. Spiritual authority, he argued, was superior to secular authority, just as the soul was superior to the body. Therefore, the Pope had the right to judge kings and emperors, but they had no right to judge him. The Church was not a department of their governments. It was a separate and higher kingdom. To Gregory, lay investiture was the ultimate symbol of everything that was wrong. It was the source of the cancer of simony. By appointing bishops, kings and emperors were usurping a sacred power that belonged to the Church alone. In 1075, Gregory held a council in Rome and formally condemned lay investiture. He declared that any emperor, king, or other secular person who presumed to invest a bishop or abbot would be excommunicated from the Church. This was a direct challenge to the most powerful ruler in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV. The emperor relied on his control of the Church in Germany to run his kingdom. His bishops were his most important administrators and supporters. He had no intention of giving up the power to appoint them. He saw Gregory's decree as an attack on his authority and the traditions of his ancestors. The conflict that followed is known as the investiture controversy. It was a titanic struggle between the two most powerful figures in medieval Europe. Henry IV responded to the Pope's ban by gathering his German bishops, many of whom he had appointed and who were loyal to him, and having them declare that Gregory was a false pope who should be deposed. This was a personal attack, and Gregory's response was swift and devastating. He excommunicated Henry IV. An excommunication was not just a spiritual penalty, it had profound political consequences. It meant that Henry was cast out of the Christian community. His subjects were no longer bound by their oaths of loyalty to him. His enemies, the powerful German nobles who were always looking for an excuse to rebel, now had the Pope's blessing to do so. Henry's political support began to collapse. He was facing a full-scale rebellion and the loss of his throne. In a desperate move to save his crown, Henry decided to seek the Pope's forgiveness. In the dead of winter, in January 1077, he traveled across the Alps to the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where Pope Gregory was staying. For 3 days, the emperor, the most powerful man in the world, stood outside the castle gates in the snow, dressed as a humble penitent begging for the Pope's mercy. It was a stunning act of public humiliation. Gregory, as a priest, could not refuse forgiveness to a repentant sinner. He lifted the excommunication. Canossa was a huge symbolic victory for the papacy. It dramatically demonstrated the new power and moral authority that the Pope could wield over even the mightiest of secular rulers. The fight was not over, however. Henry IV later regained his power, marched on Rome, and forced Gregory into exile where he died. The investiture controversy would continue for decades, with both sides fighting on the battlefield and in a war of words and propaganda. Finally, in 1122, a compromise was reached in the Concordat of Worms. It was a complex deal, but the basic idea was to separate the spiritual and secular aspects of a bishop's office. The Church would now elect its own bishops. This was a major victory for the reformers. The new bishop would then receive the spiritual symbols of his office, the ring and crozier, from another church official. After that, he would swear an oath of fealty to the king and receive the symbols of his worldly power, like a scepter, which represented his control of the lands and estates of the bishopric. This compromise formally ended lay investiture. It did not completely end the influence of kings on appointments, as they could still be present at elections and veto candidates they disliked. But it drew a clear line in the sand. The appointment of bishops was now fundamentally a church matter. This dealt a serious blow to the most blatant forms of simony. A king could no longer openly sell a bishopric, as if it were a piece of property. The Great Reform movement, driven by men like Gregory VII, had fundamentally changed the balance of power in Europe and had taken a crucial step in purifying the church from the sin of simony. The great struggles between popes and emperors over investiture were a high-stakes political drama. But the sin of simony had another, more intimate face. It was a problem that affected the daily lives of ordinary people in thousands of towns and villages across Europe. The corruption at the top trickled down, poisoning the spiritual life of the entire community. When a man bought his way into a church office, whether he was a bishop or a humble parish priest, he often viewed his position as an investment. And an investment was supposed to provide a return. A simoniac priest was not a shepherd to his flock. He was a businessman. He had paid a large sum for his job, and he intended to make that money back and more. The most direct way to do this was to charge for the spiritual services that were supposed to be free. This practice was especially cruel because it exploited people at their most vulnerable moments. Of a family with a newborn baby would be told they had to pay a fee for baptism. Without baptism, the child's soul was believed to be in jeopardy. What parent could refuse? When a couple wanted to marry, the priest would demand payment to perform the ceremony. When someone was dying, the family would have to scrape together coins to pay for the last rites, the final confession and communion that were essential for a good death and the salvation of the soul. Even burial in the church graveyard came with a price tag. These fees turned the sacraments into transactions. They cheapened the most sacred moments of life and death. For the poor who lived on the edge of survival, these costs were a heavy burden. They created resentment and a deep-seated cynicism about the church. People saw the hypocrisy. They were told in sermons that greed was a deadly sin, yet they saw the representative of God in their own village acting out of pure financial self-interest. It made them question the validity of it all. They wondered if a sacrament bought with money had any real spiritual effect. Another consequence of simony was the problem of unqualified clergy. Since men were chosen for their wealth or connections rather than their piety or education, many priests were simply not fit for the job. Some were illiterate and could barely stumble through the Latin of the Mass, which they did not understand. Others had no interest in spiritual matters at all. They might be the sons of nobles who saw the priesthood as an easy life, a way to collect an income without having to do any real work. This led to absenteeism. A man might buy several profitable church positions at once, a practice called pluralism. He might be the priest of 3 different parishes and a canon at a cathedral. He would then hire a cheap, often uneducated, and impoverished substitute, a vicar, to perform the actual duties in each place while he lived elsewhere and collected the bulk of the revenues. The parishioners were left with a priest who had no authority and little training, and they rarely, if ever, saw the man who was officially their pastor. The trade in holy relics was another area where simony ran rampant. The faith of ordinary people in the power of relics was immense. They believed that these physical objects connected them to the divine. A corrupt churchman could easily exploit this faith. A monastery might need money to build a new church. The abbot might arrange to discover the bones of a previously unknown local saint. Or he might send an agent to purchase a relic on the open market. The authenticity of these objects was often dubious at best. Countless churches claimed to have a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk or a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. It was a cynical business, turning objects of devotion into tourist attractions designed to generate donations from pilgrims. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, which resulted in the sack of the Christian city of Constantinople, brought a flood of stolen relics into Western Europe, further fueling this corrupt market. The human cost of this widespread corruption was enormous. It created a spiritual vacuum. When the official church failed to provide genuine spiritual guidance and comfort, people looked for it elsewhere. Some turned to superstition, others were drawn to heretical movements, which often began as calls for a return to a simpler, poorer, and more authentic form of Christianity, just like the apostles had lived. Movements like the Cathars and the Waldensians gained followers precisely because they offered a stark contrast to the wealth and corruption they saw in the institutional church. Simony on the ground was not an abstract theological problem, it was a daily reality that damaged the relationship between the people and the church. It deprived them of proper pastoral care. It exploited their fears and their faith for financial gain, and it fostered a climate of doubt and disillusionment. The fight against simony was not just about the power of the Pope versus the power of the Emperor. It was also a fight to restore a basic level of trust and spiritual integrity at the very heart of medieval society. The Gregorian Reform and the investiture controversy were a turning point. They did not solve the problem of simony overnight, but they marked the beginning of the end for its most blatant forms. The Compromise of the Concordat of Worms in 1122 established the principle that the Church, not the state, was responsible for choosing its own leaders. It became much harder, and much more scandalous, for a king to openly sell a bishopric to the highest bidder. The reformers had successfully reclaimed a degree of independence for the church, and had made simony a universally recognized and condemned sin. But the problem did not disappear. It simply changed its shape. It became more subtle, more sophisticated, and in some ways it moved from the royal courts into the heart of the church's own bureaucracy. The long shadow of simony continued to stretch across the later Middle Ages. Instead of an open sale, a king who wanted his preferred candidate to become a bishop might now apply immense political pressure during the election process. He could offer bribes or threaten the canons who were responsible for voting. It was not a direct purchase, but the result was often the same. A politically connected and often spiritually unqualified man was placed in a position of power. Within the church itself, new forms of corruption emerged that walked a fine line with the old sin. As the papacy grew in power and prestige after its victory over the emperors, it built a vast and complex administration in Rome called the Curia. Running this international government was incredibly expensive. To raise funds, the Curia developed a system of fees for services. If a bishop needed a papal document to confirm his election, there was a fee. If two powerful nobles needed a dispensation to marry, despite being cousins, there was a fee. These charges were justified as administrative costs, not the sale of grace. But to many outsiders, the distinction was blurry. It looked as if papal justice and favor were available to those who could pay. One of the most troubling outgrowths of this system was nepotism. Popes and cardinals would frequently appoint their own relatives, especially their nephews, to lucrative and powerful positions within the church. This was not technically simony, as no money was exchanged, but it violated the same spiritual principle. A man was being given a sacred office not because of his merit, but because of his family connections. This practice reached its peak during the Renaissance, when popes acted more like Italian princes than spiritual leaders, using the church to build dynasties and enrich their families. The Borgia family is the most infamous example of this trend. Perhaps the most fateful legacy of the church's need for money was the development of indulgences. An indulgence was a remission of the temporal punishment for sins that had already been forgiven. The church taught that even after a sin was forgiven in confession, the sinner still had to perform acts of penance, either in this life or in purgatory after death. The church, through the treasury of merits built up by Christ and the saints, could grant an indulgence to shorten this time of penance. Originally, indulgences were granted for performing pious acts, like going on a crusade or a pilgrimage. But over time, it became common to grant an indulgence in exchange for a monetary donation to the church. A special plenary indulgence was offered that promised the complete remission of all temporal punishment. Preachers traveled across Europe selling these indulgences to raise money for projects like the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The sales pitch was often crude. One infamous preacher, Johann Tetzel, used the slogan, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." To a German monk named Martin Luther, this was an abomination. It looked, smelled, and felt exactly like simony. It was the selling of salvation. It was putting a price tag on God's forgiveness. His outrage over the sale of indulgences prompted him to write his 95 Theses in 1517. He was not trying to start a new church. He was trying to reform the one he loved, calling it back to its core principles and away from what he saw as a deep and systemic corruption. That protest, rooted in the same kind of anger that had fueled the fight against simony centuries earlier, ignited the Protestant Reformation and shattered the unity of Western Christendom. The medieval struggle against simony was a fight for the identity of the church. It raised fundamental questions. Was the church a spiritual institution or a worldly kingdom? Did its authority come from God or from secular rulers? Was grace a free gift or a commodity to be bought and sold? While the reformers of the 11th century won their battle against lay investiture and the open sale of offices, the war against the temptation to mix money and faith was never truly over. The shadow of Simon Magus, the man who thought the gift of God could be purchased with silver, proved to be a very long one indeed.